Grief is your liberation. In all the quotes, the one I love the best is from Gordon Neufeld. And his quote is, "How are we changed by that which we cannot change? By finding our tears." But I thought, he's talking about grief, because it transitions us from whatever is unbearable into some greater spaciousness and capacity and love. And I know there's all sorts of contortions of grief where people get attached to it, but in its most natural force, it's a natural force of healing. If people could learn to grieve, they could be free to love, because there's nothing that we can't weather and grow from and become deeper and more profound people from with grief.
This is the Gifts of Trauma podcast, stories of transformation and healing through compassionate inquiry. I'm Rosemary Davies-Janes, and before I welcome our guest, I'd like to advise you, dear listeners, that this week's episode references HIV mortality and the violence and brutality of living in an oppressive police state. These topics may be disturbing or triggering. Now I'd like to welcome Siri Dharma, also known as Sheila Tayak, to the show. Siri Dharma, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today.
Oh, it's lovely to be here.
So Siri Dharma, I'd love for you to introduce yourself to our audience. Tell us a little bit about you.
Well, I live in Johannesburg in South Africa, and I was born here, been in one city my whole life. At the moment, I'm a founding facilitator in Compassionate Inquiry, and that means that I've been around since the course started, coming from a background of leading the Beyond Addiction course in South Africa. I have this kind of dual identity at the moment, and I have for a while. I always say I'm both Dharma and Greg, if anyone remembers that little TV program, because I'm the Siri Dharma, but I'm also the lawyer, and I lead a double life in that. For part of my week, I'm training young lawyers in probably one of the, if not the biggest law firm in Africa. So hundreds of lawyers, they're very big corporate, and I'm busy training young people. And at the same time, I'm a facilitator and a practitioner of compassionate inquiry. So I'm leading my compassionate inquiry groups. And, I like to say I live my life at the intersection of law and compassion, but that in the law firm, and that maybe in compassionate inquiry too.
Beautiful. Thank you. I'm curious, if I may ask, what sorts of issues do these young lawyers bring to you to help them with, the lawyers that you train and mentor? What do they struggle with?
Yeah, so my capacity with them is first and foremost as a teaching lawyer. So I'm working with young people. My firm takes in maybe 40 young people a year. That's just in Johannesburg. And then there's other African offices. But the work I do with them is around empowering them. And more than half of them are young Black lawyers that come from, kind of multiple layers of trauma through the apartheid years. It's a generation of young people that are now kind of getting well educated and coming into a law firm, into a really top tier law firm, not coming in from families necessarily, some do, but families that have trained their kids in how to survive in a corporate world. And that was exactly my experience. I had no corporate background. So the training that I do with them was my own idea. I came up with the idea and I approached law firms and they said, yes, please come and do this. So I try to empower them in as many ways as I can. And the first is in teaching them the law. As in the law, you need to know when you're a practicing lawyer, not a law student. They're all going to be top students. And it's mergers and acquisitions and tax and contract. And that's the kind of work my firm does. And I know how to reduce things to their basics So take the most complex, merger or corporate deal, and let's really understand this practically and easily. And then I've also devised writing courses. So I teach people how to draft contract, how to boils down to grammar, legal writing stuff. So those are the skills they need kind of professionally. And then because I'm sitting with a bunch of like 20 of them, my firm gives me a lot of time with them. They came to trust me over the years, and I sit with them and I will do mindfulness work with them. I do compassionate inquiry, when the opportunity arises. It's not really in my job description, but I've noticed, for example, sitting with a table full of young lawyers, and I'll say, well, let's go into, and I'll lead them into some kind of mindfulness. And I had the experience, and I'd look over, and one of the young men, the tears are just running down his face. It's like these young people that come in, they are full of anxiety, the lives, the pressures on them and the lives they lead, and arriving in this environment, you just pause for a moment and get met with some compassion, which is what I bring. And something beautiful can open. And I got told very complimentary, because a lot of the young people love Beyonce. They told me that instead of being the queen, they said, she's the queen bee, I'm the queen she. And my training room is the she hive. But it was such a compliment.
Oh, how lovely. And I spent over a decade in the corporate world, and it is a unique kind of setting. So, these young lawyers who come in there, keeners, they have worked so hard to get top marks in law school, and they're so thrilled to be accepted by top law firm, and then they get in there. So what types of responses can they have? Can we call it the corporate culture, just sort of generally?
Mm-hmm. And I think it's very unexpected for them to be to meet someone that comes with compassion,
Mm-hmm.
to meet them, and just this week I was sitting with some of the lawyers, and so they get some feedback on, like, one of the young lawyers said, I just got feedback from a senior lawyer, I'd done something wrong, I messed up.
Yeah.
And then I just said to him, oh, that's interesting, and I'm wondering what you're making that mean. So compassionate inquiry. And sometimes people are like, what? But in this case, it just opened up a discussion within, it's like, well, as a young Black person, that is the first person in my family to have a job in the corporate world, there's such an incredible pressure on me to keep this job. And I'm putting my younger brother through school. I've got, everyone's depending on me. And so if I get into trouble at work, what am I making it mean? But he was still able to see, wow, this predates the moment at the law firm,
Mm-hmm.
So just simple little skills with them in compassionate inquiry.
Wonderful. Thank you. And I'm just going to jump in here and let our listeners know that, in addition to being trained as a lawyer, you've also had training as a family life counselor, an addictions counselor, and you've had training in nonviolent communication and an accredited mediator. So, I'm wondering, given that you've said there's almost this split in your work between that work and your work, if I can just sort of generally state it this way, in the counseling arena, how do all these different skills play out in the work you do today in a general sense?
Yeah. And it's strange that there's always been this I'm sitting here with my fingers interlinking to show they're not separate streams. And now, where I sit now, I think probably the compassionate inquiry path is going to be more what I would want to do. But through these years as a lawyer, and I can tell you maybe a bit later about my inspiration to do law, which came from my background.
Mm-hmm.
Through all of that, I was at the same time becoming a yoga teacher. And through becoming a yoga teacher, just through great blessing, I landed up teaching a yoga class in a drug rehab. And I count that as one of my most blessed days in my entire life. I was blown away with this gift of sitting with this group of 30 addicts in primary rehabs. And I knew some of them from my past. But I had this blessing of sitting with them. And that was just something that carried forward. And then, next thing, there's Beyond Addiction, and I'm meeting Gabor. And then there's compassionate inquiry.
And I'm very curious about how Kundalini yoga plays into the addiction recovery process. Can you talk about that a bit?
Oh, at the simplest level, you're getting people to move, you're getting people to breathe. And this is, I think, basis of Gabor's work with addiction as well. But I remember it was don't be the addict, see the addict. So this idea that you can be in incredible pain and locked into all sorts of patterns, but as you develop the witnessing eye on it, that there's the healing because there's the self, the true self. And so, every time working with these addicts and just gently, gently helping them to see the addict. So, for example, I teach a class and I remember these addicts with their cigarette packets on the yoga mat because they're waiting for the class to end and they're going to run out and have their cigarette. And saying to them, okay, the class ends now. And I'll say, okay, can we just pause? And you notice that, that movement in you towards your cigarette. And you just stay with it a moment. And just that. And then, I'll go and have your cigarette.
Mm-hmm.
So there's extending moments of choice or of witnessing and bringing it. It's the growth of presence and awareness.
Yes.
So I think that is, I don't know how you recover from anything actually without that.
Yeah, I think that's a beautiful description because, just at a very superficial level, you would not pair Kundalini yoga with addiction recovery. But, getting to presence, that explains it beautifully. So I'd like to explore something else briefly. You are yourself a highly sensitive person, and you've got a deep interest in supporting other highly sensitive people. Can you tell us a little bit about what makes someone highly sensitive? Are some of us born that way? Is it our environment, our experience? Can you just let our listeners have a brief overview of that? Thank you.
That is an interesting question. And I can tell you what Elaine Aron came up with this idea of high sensitivity. And so where that is that I was born with it and where that is my environment, I don't know. But I do know that all through my childhood, I was the one that it was like, don't be so sensitive, the one that had little antenna out onto the world, was noticing everything, that's highly moved. I'm the one who can read the newspaper and start weeping, highly moved by the world, in having a very a deep experience of pain and suffering, which has been the side of sensitivity that I've known, where everything hurts like 10 times more than I'm also Pisces and my entire family is Libras, all of them. So there was a sense of being different, but and having like incredibly intense dreams and being very in touch with a deeper world, but often through a painful experience. So being highly triggerable, you could say, but this is just something that can come up as a protection. When I first read about high sensitivity, I remember, I think I was having a dream about finding the hidden book, at a university of higher learning, because it's like, oh, that's what it is. And then seeing the absolute gift of it now,
Yeah.
I relish it. And that's why when I invite people to come to my biweeklies as a facilitator, I invite the sensitive to come, because I know it's going to be, it's a little bit harder for you. You might not want to do a practice session in front of a big group of people. You might not want to. And is there a place for everybody?
Yeah, I appreciate that. That's a beautiful answer. And I am also of the highly sensitive tribe. And I remember I had an experience very much like yours when I came across the definition of highly sensitive people, and it's like, it's not just me, this is a thing, and it's not only me that feels this way. It felt so validating and nice to be recognized. So I'm so happy you're out there doing that work. It's beautiful.
You're like almost tears when you say that. Yes, beautiful.
No, it was a moment. I remember it was so exciting. As I was reading this, I was sort of galloping ahead in the description. It's like that one. Yep. It's like, oh, thank goodness.
Yeah.
Anyhow, so I'd love to shift, if we can, now to speak about your background. I know you grew up in an anti-apartheid family during the apartheid era, and you were shunned and shamed by others. You experienced violence. Tell us about that.
Yeah, it was a brutal, brutal country. And I have to say all of this is my description's always still as a white person, having an experience that has that amount of privilege attached to it, that I wasn't in the most, kind of decimated populations. But it was a brutal experience. And a little bit because my parents are not that in touch, so they brought us up in a kind of lower middle class suburb. So, and in South Africa in those days, it was everything racial, white area, black area, Indian, everything was so separate. And so we're in this white area, lower middle class. So the people are ultra racist. There's going to be no kind of sense. When I went to university, it was the first time I met people of common outlook. In that place, no. And so there was just this sense from the other kids and their parents, like, don't go to their house. Their parents are friends with like that kind of exclusion all the time. Incredibly violent. I mean, the people that we were hanging out with in high school would go around, I mean, not my friends, but people would go around bashing people just because of the color of their skin. It was violent. And I had this, he's passed now, but my father, he was an initiator. So his work was to train Black consciousness aligned workers in empowerment through trade unions. And, there was a story that he tells once of being at a train station, and the platforms are clearly whites only, black, and then the white coaches would stop on the whites only with all the like seats and lovely, comfortable coaches. And then you'd get these coaches that were for black people. And on this particular day, the black coach stopped on the white platform, and people poured out. And there was this lone, what do you call it, like a railway policeman standing up on the top of some stairs. And as the black people were streaming up the stairs he started kicking. He started kicking. And my father says he remembers a little boy being kicked so hard that his lunchbox went flying into the air. I mean, it was brutal. And what did my father do? He just went in and put his body in the way of the kicks. No, not being a particularly strong man, but there was a sort of a heroic side to him. And there was also a completely out of touch side to him. So, growing up as his children wasn't easy. And as he later said, he was also frightened. I was terrified. And when I was 12, my parents had an apartheid repression tool put onto them. They call it a banning order. And they were both banned. Both of them. It's the only time I think a couple were both banned. And what it meant was they had to give up their work immediately. They were confined to an area of Johannesburg. They weren't allowed to leave that area. And they had to sign their names at the police station every week. They weren't allowed into any court. They weren't allowed into any school. They weren't allowed into any area that was not a white area. They weren't allowed to be published. They weren't allowed to be in a group of more than 2 people at a time. That was called an illegal gathering. And then special permission to talk to one another. So we're 3 sisters, 3 girls, and we're in these racist environments. And there's no ways you can explain why this like absolutely all-powerful government doesn't approve of my family. And, there was a few teachers that knew there was something going on and gave a moment of support. But that kind of repression and being, tailed by the police and being watched, and they lifted that order after 3 years. They couldn't find work. They had to get help from someone to persuade the government to let them work, in giving up their jobs. I got selected to sing in the children's choir because I'm also a musician. And the school principal wanted to congratulate my parents, and he called and he said, come up to the school. And it was just down the road. They walked up to the school. They said, sorry, we can't come in. We have to stand on the street because the banning order prohibits us from entering a school. So it's a strange experience when you have parents involved like that. It's confusing. They're out there doing something important. And, now looking back, we can be proud of them. But at the time, it was a source of shame. So what are my parents doing? Oh, how embarrassing. We were so out of the mainstream of what our friends were doing and what they thought was normal. And it did instill in me a deep, deep sense of shame. It wasn't just something that I work with.
Wow. It's it's so bizarre. It sounds like fiction, and I know it's fact.
Yeah.
Wow, thank you for sharing that. And, it instilled shame. I'm wondering how, after that kind of upbringing, you could ever feel safe anywhere.
Yeah.
Is that lingering with you as well?
It's interesting because one of the things I do in Compassionate Inquiry is I lead the safety and connection course with Alison Creech.
Mm-hmm.
And we talk about this. I live in Johannesburg. Johannesburg has got an incredibly high crime rate. You literally are not safe.
Mm-hmm.
If at any given point, I was just reading now, how many armed robberies there were of cars in the road that I just come in the last week.
Mm-hmm.
The houses are getting armed robberies all the time. It's not safe.
Mm-hmm.
And yet, what I say in the safety and connection course is when I'm walking to the store, and you must never carry a phone with you. That's crazy. Or cash. Don't carry cash or phone. But when a car drives next to me, I often think, oh my God, I'm going to be robbed. And feel like, okay, now that is an overreaction. My nervous system is in an activated state. So it's a kind of a bit of both. I think maybe one day it would be nice to feel safe.
I agree. If you go somewhere else, can you drop that tension, or is it just built in at this point?
Now I can drop the tension, like if I'm in a different country.
Yeah. Okay, great.
And yeah, no, I do, and I know how to be very vigilant, and I think that's also a skill from childhood trauma.
Mm-hmm.
But I know how to be vigilant, so I can read a situation. I remember being in San Francisco. I studied a master's degree in law at Stanford University, and I was at a restaurant with friends in that area, and there was a fight going on. Someone was having a fight, and my friends from California were having a heart attack. I said, no, it's fine. Don't worry. I got a little bit of radar here for reading the scene
Yeah.
when it comes to danger.
Oh,
Yeah.
I'm going to invite you just to check in with your body. That was a lot that you just revisited.
Ah,
My body is registering an elevated tension, and I'm just wondering how you are feeling.
mm. Now that you say that, I can feel there's movement.
Yeah.
I guess the stories are familiar to me, and yeah, but that's nice.
Just checking in to make sure you're okay. Yeah.
I'm okay.
I don't even know how to explain it. It's almost as if my interior all constricted as I was listening, because, I've spent some time in South Africa as well. And I remember getting lost, trying to find my way back home to Rosebank. I was traveled from Rosebank to Melville in Johannesburg, and I got hopelessly lost driving because there's no street signs. Most of them had been stolen. And I realized I was going in circles and the roads aren't straight. And it was dark. And I knew I was, white woman alone in a car, obviously lost. It's like, this is not good. So it brought back that sensation. It's like, oh shoot, how am I going to get myself out of this? I did manage to call a friend, and she drove out and met me and led me back to where I was supposed to be. But it was that same sensation. So yeah. Oof. And I may not be helping your body at the moment, because I'd really like you to tell me a little bit about your experience as a young lawyer representing the ANC in the Bloemfontein courts, which is the judicial capital of South Africa. Is that right?
You know quite a bit. The judicial capital. Yeah, that's right.
Could you just explain what the ANC is?
Yeah, so the ANC, it stands for the African National Congress, and it was the main liberation movement during the apartheid years. It was, at times getting into armed struggle, but it was the main liberation movement. And once we became free, they became the government. And just a month ago, they went below a majority vote. But they've been in government, not doing that maybe as well as they did liberation, but we struggle along.
Yeah. So how was that? How was that for you?
I was very inspired into the subject of labor law by my dad because of the trade union work. And even I joined when I started, I was in the firm that I actually train at now. And one of the the cases as a young lawyer, just like in the first 6 months of my training. They had me going to, it was actually Mpopomeni at Howick, where there'd been IFP ANC violence. And I had to go and get further particulars on the injuries. And so, I remember sitting in that township at night by candlelight, looking at people's wounds from the attacks that they'd had. And that was working in the firm I'm in now, which is also a big corporate firm. But it was a little later when I went into human rights work with a small firm, and there we were representing the ANC. A lot of in the Free State area, which is also very racist, very associated with apartheid area, but also some areas closer to Johannesburg. Yeah, that would involve long drives out to these little townships. The one I was in the most was called Maliboho, in a terrible little town called Hertzogville. And we would bring court applications against the Minister of Law and Order, like in a kind of sense of review of his powers, for declaring areas unrest areas, because that would give the state great power. And so that would also just going into it was beautiful work. I mean, I think maybe that was closer to Johannesburg, where I, had to drive behind a march and then onto a field, and where the police were tear gassing. But we were tear gas, we knew already from university. But and I was lucky to have a car, but also hearing the police open fire on people, and I remember that day as having a sense, after I got back to my hotel, holding a glass in my hand and thinking, this glass could shatter. This glass could shatter. And that was showing me that there was trauma, because I was in the proximity of those gunshots, and then going to the hospital to talk to the young people that had been fired at by the police. There was all sorts of different kinds of work.
Is there anything in particular that, as you think back to that time, that really stands out for you?
Such a big blank that makes me wonder if I've got a bit of a shutdown around it. Do you know what I mean? Like, what is it?
Mm-hmm.
I was having a love affair with one of the ANC activists. I remember that. There was a little, what an amazing man as well, that was putting his life in danger a lot, one of the activists. And I mean, there was a sense of the work it wasn't very fulfilling, in the sense that it was more like, get out there and do it, but don't do any thinking. And I've got a good brain for law. And also just the danger of it, and driving long hours. I don't know how to answer that question, like what stands out. I'm glad I did it.
Well, maybe I can help a little bit. I'll just share my perspective. It almost sounds like the story that might be told by a war correspondent. It's, the frenetic energy, horrendous scenes witnessed, and like a drive to get done the work that you came there to do.
Yeah. As you speak, I'm kind of listening to you curiously, as if you're talking about someone else. It's strange. Like, yeah, that's right. I don't think I was cut out for to be that. Because I'm thinking of another case where there'd been a murder of an attempted attack on some white children, and the police rounded up some people they thought were I don't think they even thought they were the perpetrators, but they just wanted to be seen to take people in. And my client was someone who the police had beaten up on their way or something. It's a whole long story. But I remember going with him to an identity parade, and he was looking at these police as being the ones that they tortured him. And as we were in the corridors of the police station, the murder and robbery squad in some terrible place, I remember he said, that's the man. And I didn't feel powerful enough to do anything about that. And I look back on that and think, gee, I wasn't the best serving lawyer there, because later, there was a denial that he could identify anyone, and it all went away. That I wasn't embodying a certain power that maybe he deserved. I wish I could have helped him. I wish I could have been there as a powerful lawyer, and maybe this is partly a shame-based response, but it seems like, because that was never me, that wasn't my place in the world to be that lawyer. And I was frightened, and I couldn't do what he needed done to protect his rights.
Yeah. Well, I wonder if in not protecting his rights, you protected his life, because there would have been serious pushback to an accusation like that from a Black man in that era.
Mm, maybe so.
Yeah.
Yeah, that feels.
Just curious. Anyhow, and I'd like to move on, if that's okay with you, and talk a little bit about the TRC, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, for a moment, which for our listeners was a court-like restorative justice body assembled in South Africa in 1996 after the end of apartheid. It was authorized by Nelson Mandela and chaired by the late Archbishop Desmond Tutu. And what happened was that the TRC invited witnesses who were identified as victims of gross human rights violations to give statements about their experiences. And some of these were aired in open sessions. Perpetrators of violence could also give testimony and request amnesty from both civil and criminal prosecution. So that's just a little background from our listeners. And Sheila, I'd love to hear your perspective on the impact of the TRC, both in 1996 when it rolled out, and I'm curious as to whether there's any lingering impact of that process today.
You know, this is probably not something that I'm going to be able to talk much on. It seemed like even at the time that it was there, that I knew it was happening. I wasn't queued up as to the relevance of it. I knew what you said. Looking back now, I'm saying, oh wow, that was a good thing. But I wonder, and I'm thinking of this topic of forgiveness. That when one talks about forgiveness, the biggest red flag to me, and it's something that comes from my life experience, and that is the danger of bypassing. This idea of we forgive. We're good people and we forgive. So I really can't say, but I just get that sense with the forgiveness process that one can't move from injured to forgiving, even if it is through an exchange of truth. That's probably better than nothing, but you can't leave out the anger. You can't leave out the anger that comes. And I get the sense in South Africa that hasn't even happened yet.
That's a very interesting perspective. I appreciate that, because what I was wondering is, what's the difference between reconciliation and forgiveness? Or is there a distinction between the two?
Yeah, maybe not the same thing.
Like sharing stories is not sharing emotions. So, maybe there was some healing, but I hear you. There's still much healing.
And better to share the stories than not.
Absolutely.
Because the other thing that I saw in growing up here, in a family that was, more aware but less protected, and that was how most people just, had no clue what was going on. They didn't know. And so, and now we see the world with I watch this news, so I don't know anything about your truth, and I watch this news. It's much worse. And so when the stories interlink or interlace, I think that's very important as a step.
Yeah, agreed. There's a theme emerging from this. You've long had a passion for justice, and in part of your role in the Compassionate Inquiry community is as one of the integrity and equality officers. I wonder if you could say a little bit about that. In compared to your background within the CI community must feel very different.
The sense I have of it is that idea that if one can hear the perspective of the other, which is now touching back on what you were saying about the truth and reconciliation, that's a step towards something. That if you can step into the shoes of the other, it's the beginning of a bridge. If you just even know that how another sees the world. And I guess that's touching in on that forgiveness of, the forgive them for they know not what they do. When you realize the very wounded place the other is coming from, and it wasn't about me. They were just playing out their wound when this thing happened. The work I've done a little more of has been kind of inquiry into breaches of ethics and that here and there, a little bit more of that, and which is legal training, very much useful.
I do see that there might be a bit of a connection, though, and I might be reaching for this. You said way back when you were talking about your upbringing that your parents were a little disconnected. And, so their perspective was something that was very different to yours. So, your whole life, you've been aware that different people have different perspectives, and, bringing those together can be a very useful exercise.
Yeah, and I guess I didn't even know that I had a perspective. Because if I can just jump back just a little to my mom. So, and I know my mom came from a generation, but she couldn't say, how are you? She couldn't speak to emotion at all. She was never sad, never angry. She was just nice. And so that idea of a little sensitive child coming into the world who really needs help with identifying emotion, that path through life, there was no me there, just a little ghost, So learning to find like, oh, what is it that you have? What is it that you need? It touches me.
I understand that children have a special role in your life and work. Can you tell us about that?
Oh, I get touched as well. Through my work in Kundalini Yoga, I was taken to a local orphanage. It's quite a well-known one, and for having the children born with HIV, born HIV positive through those years, and there was no medication available for it in those days. I remember going there with some visiting yoga teachers, and we were at the orphanage, and they took us into the hospice section. Sorry, I don't want to be over graphic. I'm very straightforward in my descriptions. Is that okay?
That's okay.
And we were sitting in the hospice where the dying children are. And there was a little girl with a hole in her cheek. I remember it went all the way through, and there was the smell of when eardrums have been burst, which is very typical with the little HIV positive kids that were almost in AIDS. And I remember that little girl, and I was freaked out. And this little girl came and climbed into my lap. It's like, I'm claiming you. There was just some sense of it. And I remember going home that day, and my neighbors who were heroin addicts had left their bloody needles in the street, and the kids were playing with them. And there was just a sense of touching in on the darkest thing. And I don't know where I got this from, but I had a whole lot of young girls in this kind of little bit arty, but quite lower class area I lived in, little black girls come to me for yoga, and I rounded them up and I said, we're going back to the orphanage and we're going to teach yoga there. And so I landed up going back for 6 years and teaching yoga. And in those days, there was no medication for the kids. So they were dying. And we'd arrive to teach the class, and then someone would say, and Tubby Sing's gone to Jesus. I can see the impact this is having on you. And I tell you, in me, it's just freedom as I tell you this story, because it was what taught me to grieve. It was the most beautiful lessons. I started to work with the kids and say, well, we're going to have an acknowledgement here about the kids that are dying. In 1 year, I think the 6 of them died. It means I was falling head over heels with one little boy named Polisi, who became my foster son, and he's now with me, and he's 27. We'd make up a little song, because I play the guitar, and we'd say, Tubby Sing is with Jesus. And Tubby Sing. And then we'd put the name of the next child. That one is with Jesus. And we'd all sing together, just to remember. Just let's pay attention to the fact that a child is gone. I think I saw something was going on there. I thought, this is deeper than I'm aware of. I remember a little girl, really with AIDS. And then these volunteers would come in, and I remember they'd crying with grit. And I was like, wait a second, something more is going on here. There's some deep universal energy of helping you heal your grieving, you volunteer. Because that little girl pulled her little Pokemon toy out of her pocket. She wasn't there to be grieved over. She was there to play. She was just a kid. And I learned then how to grieve, because I fell in love with Polisi, this little boy, and I made space for grieving. It's been a journey with me ever since. I'm almost the keener at the funeral, because I'm so deeply in touch with grief, and it arises and I allow it. And there were 4 years where I grieved every day, and I think it just let go so much. I realized the journey with those children was one of increasing happiness. So, you know, I go to the orphanage because I want the happiness of it. You know, so there was just these moments, like going into the hospice, and there's this little boy looking very AIDS-like, and I'm singing Nkosi Sikeleli, which is our national anthem. I'm singing it on the guitar, and he takes my hand and he just to his heart, just in a moment. And then I heard he died the next day.
Mm.
These are moments of the passing and the crossing and what's going on, something deeper and more beautiful, and it brought such healing in my life. Even though having Mpolisi has stretched me beyond anything I thought possible. Let me not say that, not to be the case. Oh my God.
Yeah.
He stays alive on medicine.
Oh, thank you for sharing. That was beautiful. You just made sense of the presentation you did a couple of years ago called Many Kinds of Tears. And
yeah,
I'm wondering, I'd love your perspective. Grieving is something that I think, you know, especially in the first world, it's not talked about. It's acknowledged, but it's not really indulged. I wonder what you could share about grief that might be useful for our listeners.
Yeah, grief is your liberation. You know, there's a quote in all the quotes, the one I love the best is from Gordon Neufeld. And his quote is, "How are we changed by that which we cannot change? By finding our tears. And how are we changed by that which we cannot change? By finding our tears." And I know he's a pediatric person. He's speaking about allowing children to really feel disappointment, not protecting them from. But I thought, he's talking about grief, because it transitions us from whatever is unbearable into some greater spaciousness and capacity and love. And I know there's all sorts of contortions of grief where people get attached to it, and you know, there's all sorts of things that can, but in its most natural force, it's a natural force of healing. If people could learn to grieve, they could be free to love, you know, because there's nothing that we can't weather and grow from and become deeper and more profound people from with grief. So what I'm always saying in my compassionate inquiry work is, when someone says sadness, I'll say, well, what do you mean? Because there's so many meanings of the word sadness. Oh, you mean depression? Okay, that's something else. Oh, you mean distress and pain and hurt? Okay, we need to inquire. You making something mean something, you bringing something forward from your younger part. Oh, you mean mourning and sorrow for the loss of connection, the loss of this life that you could have had. That's the place to just stop and stay and just feel it.
Yeah. And there's such power in just naming it, just as we spoke about with the discovery of what is a highly sensitive person, understanding that what you thought was sadness is actually mourning. There would be freedom in that. Is that what people feel?
Yeah, I mean, I ask people, it's a bit of a convoluted thing, but it's very helpful, because you know, I bring it into my bi-weekly when I facilitate, and I'll say, when someone says I'm sad, and then we inquire, what do you mean? What is that? And what do you need? I need you to stay with me while I feel this. That's just grief.
Yeah.
But the inquiry of, you know, abandoned, or, you know, this is, I'm sad because of abandonment. There's a beautiful inquiry there.
Mm-hmm.
You know, what are you making that mean? What kind of person gets abandoned? Touch in on the shame.
Yeah, beautiful. Thank you. So we are coming closer to the end. I'm curious, is there anything that I haven't asked you that you would like to share with our listeners?
I think the one thing was, I was trying to think what drew me to compassionate inquiry. And the one aspect of it was this quest for the truth, this quest for truth. You know, in compassionate inquiry, I think it's that quote from Jesus Christ or something: when you know the truth will liberate you. Or it's only when compassion is present can we know the truth. And there's always this question about, what do you mean by the truth? What is that? And I've slowly come to bring it into an understanding for myself that there's two things it could mean. And one is the truth of what it was really like for you. the truth of the suffering. Like, for example, there now, when I feel shame and I go into the dorsal shutdown of shame, I'll think, is this what you felt like when you were that little girl? This feeling is the truth because it's what I actually felt. So, it can be painful, as Gabor says. And then there's the deeper level of truth, which is that nothing can touch you because you are, immortal in that bigger sense. So the bringing together of that was, it's only by this ability to, as we practice in CI, to hold the container for all these painful, painful things. As Gabor says, I'm not angry, the anger is in me. So let me not identify, I'm not the anger. There's anger in me. Can I feel it? Where is it? Really experience that anger. When we do that, we get into touch with the real me, which is that witnessing parent, the witnessing eyes of love. And so knowing the truth of this brings up the truth of that. And so it becomes one truth.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why you can say your burden is your liberation.
That makes perfect sense.
And compassionate inquiry is a vehicle for experiencing that. Your burden is your liberation, rather than just the source of the pain in your life. So there was a quote I heard, I think it was her name, Joan Halifax. She said, first you become transparent to yourself, then others become transparent to you, and then you become transparent to others. And so I just like with this truth and being sensitive, being able to, I can feel the painful feelings in like micro detail. And because I've got a good brain, I'm learning and I'm watching and I'm teaching myself about shame by being in shame and anger by being in anger, becoming transparent. Like, I know myself. Now, when I look at others, I know them better because I can see some of that in them. And this idea of becoming transparent to them, that's a beautiful, wondering I have. Like sometimes you can see me for just the joyful authenticity I am. And the rest of the time I'm full of shit,
Oh, I don't see the full of shit, but I will take your word on that. So, gosh, and it seems, everything what's been weaving through this whole conversation is like there's a polarization that you somehow unite so beautifully, growing up in this terrifying, unimaginably violent world. And you're bringing peace to people, you're helping people find the truth, and truth was buried when I went to South Africa as an art student. I thought I was coming back to university to study political science. I abandoned that course of study because I thought, looking at what was reported versus what was happening in actuality versus what people were talking about, there is no way, there is no truth in politics, but there is truth in people. So I switched from political science to psychology, and I'm very happy I did. But it was baffling to me how there could be so many different perspectives being reported as truth about the same incident, about the same time. And, international papers were different from local paper. It was kind of like gaslighting. It felt that way.
And that's the world today, even more.
It is. So in a way, it was probably good preparation. Yeah. So.
And I say one other thing, that at the conference coming up in Romania, the class that I'm teaching there is called The Dance of Shame and Anger. And it's around finding your power from the shame and climbing the ladder up through the sympathetic, through the anger, to the ventral again. And I'm going to be very brave and have everyone do the dance of power. We're going to dance. Are you going to be at the conference?
I will. I'm very glad you shared that, because I would love to be at that session for sure. Definitely.
And that's my own work at the moment, climbing the ladder through feeling the anger that was squashed down by that shame.
Oh, goodness, yes. Do you have any last words for listeners who are personally facing issues involving violence, injustice, addiction, sadness, grief, people who are perhaps struggling to understand how to forgive or have compassion for themselves or others?
And it seems through all the experience that, there's no coincidence. in what comes our way. Somehow whatever you need is right there. That's what you work with. And it's just that ability to grow your spaciousness and to be able to hold the most terrible things, but to be able to hold them without getting lost in them. And that's a skill you develop. You develop it through meditation, where you get the eye onto the mind, and you develop it through practices like compassionate inquiry, where you inquire into the body. With that, everything is possible. We can be what we're, the authentic beauty that we're born to be. And it emerges more and more as we do the work, as we do the work. So it's all possible. And it just seems so elusive sometimes if you've not heard of it or you haven't done it. But there it is.
Great wisdom. And it sounds almost unimaginably simple. If it's this easy, why isn't everyone doing it? And, I guess it requires us to really slow down, to make space, which is a high demand currency in today's world. Time, making space, stepping outside of the distractions. So beautifully said.
And start by making a little bit of time in your day to sit still. Start there, even if it's 5 minutes a day, because that opens it up and it becomes so valuable, doesn't it?
It does.
It becomes so valuable.
Very valuable.
Yeah.
Very valuable.
Yeah.
My last question. What brings you the greatest joy in life?
I love to play and dance and sing, and I play quite a few instruments and a lot of music. But at the moment, I'm noticing, because my current struggle is connecting more with people. I'm considering a move out of Johannesburg to be more in deep connection with people. I'm finding that's what brings me the greatest joy. Like, I know that in this conversation, we are very connected. So I'll feel this with me. I'll carry this with me. A sense of having deeply connected with you. And that's what I'm looking for more.
Thank you. Thank you so much for being with us today. And just what a tapestry of different threads your background has brought together. Thank you so much for sharing your life and your story and your wisdom with us today.
So lovely to be here. And just know I didn't even tell you the half of it.
We'll save that for next time.
Thank you so much, Rosemary. It was beautiful to be with you.
The Gifts of Trauma is a weekly podcast that features personal stories of trauma healing, transformation, and the gifts revealed on the path to authenticity. Please note, this podcast is for informational purposes only. It is not a substitute for personal therapy or a DIY formula for self-therapy. We'd like to thank you for being here today, and we'd also like to thank our guests, as well as Gabor Mate, Sataram Kaur, and the Compassionate Inquiry admin team, marketing team, and podcast team. Please join us again next week to hear more stories of transformation and healing through Compassionate Inquiry.